Hello, everyone. We are streaming live. Attendees in the queue are now being let in across Canada and worldwide. Welcome to What's Up Wednesday. My name is Craig Mackay, your host. What do you do in the middle of the winter, when the weather's getting you down, right? I say be a rebel, right? Do something outstanding. Take time for yourself. Go skiing, snowshoeing, join the carnival. Today is a good day to be a rebel. James Dean was born today in 1931, actor, of course, from the movie Rebel Without a Cause. Be a hero and help someone out. Billy Bishop, Canadian First War flying ace, was born today in 1894, right here in Ontario. Owen Sound, to be exact. Or delve into the new science of data, like Jules Verne, the French writer, known as the father of science and fiction, born in 1828. Today's show is not fiction, but the future is upon us faster than we can imagine. The science of data, data engineering, and artificial intelligence are creating a world where science fiction is now fact. Our guest speaker will help unlock the mystery of data science and provide some strategies for management consultants on how to plan and execute on data investments for you and your clients. Before I hand the controls over to our guest, a couple of reminders. The Converge networking event is coming up on February 28th, featuring John Gelder and Joyce Bassey. On March 8th, What's Up Wednesday will focus on women in consulting with guest host Jennifer Smith. She will be joined by Alana Boltwood from KPMG, Ashka Work with Work Consulting from British Columbia and the Institute of BC, and Damilola Odolai from Sun Life. On April 12th, What's Up Wednesday will focus on recent changes in the essentials of management consulting and the common book of knowledge. Guest speakers will be Hussam Shah and Kevin Schwenker. Learn the secrets of the trade on that one. Also, the Ontario AGM, April 25th. It's this time of year in our association, getting ready for that AGM, to step up and get involved. You can join our boards, one of our boards, councils, or a director at large. Look for the link in the chat to fill out a nomination form and get involved as a director at large on one of our councils. I want to thank everyone for being here today. If you're a guest, welcome to the show. You should consider a full-time membership. If you are a member and have not renewed for 2023, please do so at your earliest convenience. It's Groundhog Month too, apparently. Good way to get out of the winter doldrums. I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of all lands that we are on today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Here in Ottawa, I'm grateful to the Algonquin people. Across Eastern Ontario, the territory covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, respectfully, traditional territory of the Iroquois, Mohawk, and Huron-Wendat. This show, by the way, will be recorded and is available on the CMC YouTube channel. We will advise all our registrants when that availability is up, and we'll send you the PDF of today's PowerPoint deck. As usual, the rules of the game today, we ask you to remain on mute to submit your questions via the chat. Our guest speaker today is Ron Schwartz. With over 25 years of experience, Ron is a motivating person and leader. He is an engaging and strategic thinker. As a senior executive, he still finds time to volunteer, providing sound advice and mentorship. His company, Adante Consulting, implements projects in three main ways: business strategy development, data science, data analytics, data mining, and digital transformation. Equally comfortable with hands-on in a leadership role or as an advisor, Ron can match operations to strategy and help clients resolve complex business and technology-related matters, often with data science and analytics as the cornerstone. Ron is a former PwC partner, IBM executive, and holds an MBA and the FCMC designation. He's been running Adante Consulting for over 10 years. Ron has taught courses at various universities and university levels, speaks at conferences, and has many articles published over the years. I was really pleased when Ron accepted the invitation to discuss data on What's Up Wednesday. And this is a topic that's very dear to my heart, and so is Ron. So welcome, my friend. How are you today? Here. Yes.
Oh, good, Craig. Thanks very much. That was a long introduction. Thank you. Very flattering. I want to meet that guy someday. I think we're good to go here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna talk about three things today, and we're gonna kind of block a little bit of time to cover them all. We're gonna talk a little bit about the state of the art in 2023. We're gonna talk a little bit about how to help clients adopt data projects because they're tricky for a whole bunch of reasons. And we're going to talk about return on investments because I think those are also questions we get a lot. And when Craig asked what we want, how we should talk about this, what we landed on was consultants, know a lot about a lot of things, but this is a place that the world keeps changing. So it seemed wise to start with a bit of a state of the art. Sandra, it occurs to me, I don't know how polls will work when I flip to the poll in a moment, when I let people choose questions. So I'm going to flip and boldly hope that a poll occurs.
I think we have one up here already.
Okay, well, then I think you're way ahead of me. Poll one. The first state of the art is really ChatGPT, and you can answer a little bit of all of the questions. But I think the real question is, what do you know? Choose as many as apply. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it when it settles down here a little bit.
It looks like a lot of us have heard about it, but not really used it.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting too, right? A few people tried it and were impressed. A few tried it and were not so impressed. And people are wrestling with, will it help their clients? So can we share the results? How do we do that?
We are sharing the results.
We are sharing the results. All right.
Next slide, please.
Next slide. Okay. So if those were the questions, I'm going to tell you what I did before the session. I asked ChatGPT to tell me what to talk about. And I specifically asked it to write a 250-word blog on data science advice for consultants in 2022. And I got the year wrong when I did it, which goes to show I might need an AI to ask ChatGPT questions. But the text here is what it replied with. And this is in the presentation. You'll get the presentation when you see it. So if you haven't tried it, it's kind of an interesting thing to try because it does surprising things. And I presume a few of you are going to read this, but it's actually, this is kind of interesting on a bunch of levels. It talks about some skills. It talks about some technical stuff in the second paragraph. It talks about how you can drive change. It talks about strong communication skills. It talks about the importance of understanding the business and the industry. I actually asked it to revise the answer a couple of times. And the entire dialogue, all three questions are actually in the appendix to the presentation. But there's a reason that a few of the people who've tried it were impressed. It does kind of interesting little things. When you dig right into it, it's pretty general though. It's not very specific about do this or do that or do this next or do that next. And that's kind of one of the things that we get to talk about a lot on this. And so I think that it's kind of interesting, and I'd encourage trying and encourage looking at the things that are going on. But this is really, when you stop and you think about this in context of what's going on in the world of data science, the new bright, shiny object. And I think that it's important to think about these things this way because it's very easy to get distracted by bright, shiny objects. And it's very easy to go spend this year's budget on bright, shiny objects, whether or not they're going to do things. And sometimes when I try to find the things that are the most helpful, I actually are last year's or the year before's bright, shiny objects. So ChatGPT, I think there's something going on here. And most importantly, one of the things that you'll see in the notes to this is Google recognized this is actually a really big problem for them, that someone could do something like this. And they declared something that sounds very dramatic inside Google called a code red. And very quickly, they've announced so far a new product that they're going to bring to market called Bard. And the Bard is going to be their answer to OpenAI's ChatGPT. So ChatGPT isn't going to have an impact on a bunch of levels, but more impactful for most people are probably still in terms of how we do things, last year's and other recent developments that are still getting better and better and better, which is what ChatGPT will be. So, you know, there's things like low code and no code technologies. There's sorting out strategies and architectures that arise from data meshes and data fabrics and data lakes. And, you know, it makes data warehouses sound so 2015, right? If you're a big firm, you're probably worried about Snowflake or Databricks or some, you know, equivalent class of product. But what's really best when you stop and you kind of distill away the hype of it all? What's really best depends on what you need, what you can use, what you can adopt, what your people can do, and what you want to get done. So I think we're going to flip back to that problem, because what's new is there's an awful lot of opportunity to be distracted from making progress. So I don't know if there's any questions, keep them coming in the chat. But I think that it's we're going to focus a little bit on how you make some forward yards in 2023, recognizing what's going on. And for us, almost all of our projects fall into two really big buckets: things we call data engineering and things we call data science. And the data engineering bits are all about getting the data out of all of the inaccessible, hidden away, hard to understand, difficult to manage places that it's stored in, and making it accessible and usable and curated and right. And those are projects that sometimes end up in data warehouses or data lakes or something like that, but they are all about plumbing. They aren't exciting, but it turns out they're important, because it turns out all the things that you have in all your source systems are often, I don't want to say wrong exactly, because they're often right in that context, but not fit for purpose when you want to turn them into better information. You know, we do a lot of work with insurance companies, and every transaction in an insurance world, whether it's a claim or a payment on an account or a something, has about 9 dates associated with it. And which date you use, or which 3 dates you use, turn out to really matter. And it's not always, as it turns out, most importantly, the transaction date. It's often something else. It might be an accounting date or a claim reported date or something like that, that turns out to be very important in all that. So there's a huge amount of work in data engineering to get high quality data out. That's distinct from us from data science work. Data science work is all about figuring out what the data actually means and what it's telling you. This is the job that is analysis and thinking and really what we often call analytics usually. And they're what if questions. It's what can we learn about? Are there correlations? Is there causation? Can you test a hypothesis that something is true or false? And when you compare the tools and the techniques for engineering projects and science projects, we often end up saying that the engineering projects are all about SQL and ETL and tools that get things out of systems. And here they're statistics, and they are a bunch of new analytic methods like AI and machine learning. And so we find a whole bunch of things in the tool and technique package. So I think it's important to separate out what your client's buying, what you're selling, what you're skilled at. And it kind of helps a lot to think this through. The data science work typically ends up for us in curated data sets, models, and predictions, which is quite different from what the data engineering work turns out, which is, you know, ETL and databases and bucket loads of reconciliation work. And simplifying it into two big buckets is useful, but it turns out maybe there's a third bucket. Business intelligence is kind of a fuzzy thing that sometimes sits often for us more in the data engineering side, sometimes in the data science side, but it's kind of the modern version of reporting. And it, if done well, helps people find trends and dig into data really fast and gets rid of the 80-page printed reports that you have to scour over with a fine-tooth comb or a microphone to find something that's out of trend. So I think that there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in the BI space. That's a lot of work for us too. So while we talk about it as data engineering or data science, and we will often put the BI work in kind of the data prep bucket, it sometimes spans the space a little bit. I don't know if there are any, if there are any questions, I would say keep them coming in the chat. But I think that this is kind of how we go at it and how we look at it. And I hope that's kind of a good starting point, because if you're looking at the world in 2023, I would say helping clients to figure out which bucket they're in and master what needs to be done in a particular bucket remains one of the most important things, even with all the new stuff that's going on in the world. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat, Craig, or if there are any thoughts that twig to you as we kind of work through this. Can anybody hear me? Is anybody still there?
I'm just teasing you. I was curious, Ron, we talked about this before, but some of the tools for BI that you would recommend?
So there's a little bit of, so the big tools are things like Power BI and Tableau. And what they are expert at are visualizations and filtering and drill down. And we like both of them. There are a lot of tools in that space. The big ones are certainly Power BI and Tableau. Power BI from Microsoft has engineered for itself the advantage that it's relatively low cost at the small number of user end. Tableau, a little more expensive, but actually more organized for some things, better organized for some things in the user self-exploration of the data space for us. So depending on what you're doing, if you're building dashboards, I'd say there's no actual difference, the meaningful difference between the two. If you're encouraging user exploration and user investigation, some Tableau licenses might be easier for people to use. If you have a large organization and you're already in the Microsoft stack, you go with Power BI.
Now
Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say, we've been using QuickSight from Amazon, AWS.
Ah, yes, QuickSight. We're actually doing a project where QuickSight is probably a contender for how we deploy. And QuickSight's, if you're in the AWS space and the data's in the AWS space, this is actually a thing that's probably worth talking about for just a second, Craig. The cloud is coalescing around cloud providers.
Yeah.
And Google will have offerings in the space. AWS has offerings in the space. And Microsoft has the Azure offering in the space, and it's often going to turn out to be the case that it's actually to be aligned with your cloud configuration.
And the tools that they offer, yeah.
And the tools that they offer.
Yeah.
So QuickSight is absolutely something we should have added to the list here. I should have had it.
Remember Cognos from years ago?
Yep.
They started this whole thing, but anyways.
They did it before these products got to be what they are and databases got as fast. And they required an intermediate technology that you don't hear about much anymore called the data cube.
Yeah.
And so the data cube remains at the center of the stuff that they did, except that you're not really building cubes anymore unless you're already committed to that architecture.
Yeah, but the dimensions you build in the back end really reflect the KPIs that you want to get out at the front end.
100%.
Yeah.
And that's a great word. We're going to come back to that. KPIs.
Cool.
Can I move on?
Yeah. Adoption.
Let's talk about how we drive adoption. Another quick poll here. I want you to think about, as you've tried to drive adoption, if for any of you who have with any projects like this, what are the biggest challenges? Check all that apply that have impacted your project. There should be an other bucket here. If you have another one, you can put it in the chat. We put a few of the big ones up on top.
Yeah, not widely used and not properly used.
and a lot of hard to work with client expectations. Right, that's what we're seeing here, and people can see these results again. Right, that's what I'm in that. Okay, I see nods. That's good. That nods are good. I like that. Okay, so you guys are pretty savvy consultants for the most part. The problem of vague and unrealistic client expectations sneaks up on us. It's not that we don't know at the beginning. But I think that when people are working in a place that's newer or, you know, we're trying to figure it out, I think the question is, how do we tackle that? Or we built something good, but not widely used. That's a pretty common one too. So is the client didn't have a team that could adopt it. And that's a really interesting problem. I'm going to kind of move on a little bit as we talk about some of these things, because I think these questions are really kind of important. For us, adoption really means the client's using what we built. And so we're constantly asking the question, how do we get them to use it? And I think the question is, what are we building and why are they going to use it and how are they going to use it? And I think that's a really interesting question to keep at the forefront, because the job isn't to build a data answer. The job is in the subtitle here. We're really on a journey that's helping clients to become data savvy. And when you actually give them something, whether it's a warehouse or a dashboard or something that produces some actual meaningful insights, we have a pretty interesting forecasting model that kind of looks forward at things and kind of helps people to understand what's likely to come. Or AI bots, or, you know, dynamic pricing algorithms, or, you know, all sorts of stuff that goes on in the models and predictions of data science space. The key things that underpin actual adoption, number one, and it's in bold and it's bigger because it can't be stressed enough, is the rightness of the data. And this goes back a little bit to something we said a few minutes ago, the data in your source systems. It's probably right at some level, but it may not be useful. And getting the useful stuff out of there and slimming it down and turning it into something that can be made to be interesting and accessible is a real key to people believing the data is right, but also it has to be reconciled within a millimeter of correctness. It has to be absolutely correct. If you go back and you look at last year's sales and the number is not what people think last year's sales is, you don't get a second chance to use the tool, right? They're going to walk away and say, yeah, I tried that once, it wasn't right. And we still have a client that we're trying to get to build a warehouse, and their answer to us was, yeah, we tried that about 15 years ago. It was a very expensive project and it was never right. And we say, but so much has changed. You got to try this again. And they say, yeah, we believe you, but we're not doing that yet. Just, 15 years later, right? So the rightness of the data, I can't stress that enough. But on top of that is the usability of the tools. And this is where most of our projects start and stop. We build great data and we put great tools on there, but we don't take the next step of driving the client to really figure out what their new process is. And if they don't have a new process, they're highly likely to stick with their old process. And if they stick with their old process, they probably aren't adopting what you built. And so the overwhelming conclusion here is these are really change management projects. Choose your scope carefully. Is this an engineering or a data science or a BI project? Is this who's got to do something different? How do you make the something different happen? This is, build a better mousetrap and the world will be the path to your door, not. Right? This is build a better mousetrap and teach people how to get to it and then repeat, rinse and repeat. And I would say one other thing on the subject of choose your scope carefully. Excuse me. I would say there are many maturity models out there, many of which are actually quite good. We don't even have a favorite. That we adopt a few based on circumstance a little bit, but excuse me. But if your client is at a low level of maturity, it's unwise to build something for them that demands a high level of maturity. If they can barely get data out of their core systems and you build them something that requires, excuse me, let me just have another sip of this, a high level of data governance along the way, you're creating a speed bump on the way to better adoption. And many of those speed bumps on the way to better adoption, with a little bit of careful planning, can be avoided. And I think that's a really important kind of change management scope maturity conversation that helps a little bit with some of the early conversations that we were having in this piece about excuse me, very determined little swallow that went the wrong way there. The adoption issues. So scope, expectations. I think that scope and the idea that maturity can be connected. You can use them to plan the project scope and what you're going to deliver and how people are going to adopt and how you're going to move them through it is ultimately the key to adoption, helping clients along the data savvy journey and helping them to think through the think through kind of a really good outcome for all this. I don't know if there are any questions, Craig, as we kind of talk that through a little bit. Sorry.
Well, I think from Lucien, he's asking, is it better to transition to the new system in parallel, or to introduce something cold? And I think that from my understanding as well, there's a couple of things that might play into that scenario that Lucien is asking about, because some people want to get some of the really important data out there, and some people don't want to get it out there. And so I think that sometimes you've got those people avoiding change and those people who really want to push the change. And maybe that ties into Lucien's question about, you know, how does this transition, you know, maybe get achieved more in a more productive manner, or more complete, successful manner.
Many maturity models will talk about data sharing as a characteristic of a more mature organization. And when people see data as power, there's no question they're going to say, we have to control this. The more you say, we're going to open this up, the more those people in particular are threatened. So short answer for us is probably wise, at least for data projects, to show both systems for a while at the same time in parallel. And I say that because people need to believe that the old data that they used to get can be reconciled to, validated against, look the same as, be seen to be correct. But I would actually decommission something at some point, and I would stop funding something, and I would take something away after a suitable transition period, whatever that ends up needing to be. And we actually have done that over time. Or we make something we're doing so compelling. We have one client on some management dashboards, and one of the things we built in is a forecast to year end, a revenue forecast to year end. And it starts to kick in at about 6 months into the year. And they love being able to check how the forecast changes daily for their year end results. Are they going to make budget? Are they not going to make budget? And our year end forecast is actually, it's become pretty reliable for them. So they've started to look at that, and they've started to understand that. And that's a driver that goes to the new thing that no old thing had. So if they're old reports, they don't need them anymore, because the live stuff is actually does something really interesting they couldn't have done before.
But sometimes people will get information and they don't realize that their actions as a result of that information are changing processes, right?
Yep.
And it's kind of inadvertent.
And sometimes that's good, and sometimes you have to change the process explicitly.
And other times I've actually let people work with it inadvertently for a little while before coming out and saying, okay, guess what? Now you need to put in some new steps.
Yeah. And, you know, we have one client where a particular group has been producing reports for a long time because they're very complicated to produce. And they've gotten so complicated that they came along and asked us to automate the whole report set. And so suddenly there's a bunch of people who are doing work that they are deliberately trying to make them stop doing that. And it's really kind of interesting because they want to stop, but they need to believe with maniacal kind of precision that the data that they're going to produce in the new reports is perfect. And it turns out their old reports weren't perfect, by the way, as we're now fixing a bunch of those things. So it's kind of interesting that they're wrestling with that question. And so suddenly they're saying, actually, we don't need it to be perfect. We need it to be better than it was and more than good enough to go. And they're wrestling with how that works exactly and how we decide where those cut points are. I'm going to move on. We're going to talk about this because we're going to come back and build on some of these conversations in a moment. But change management, choosing your scope, maturity models. And I think we're going to talk about them again a little bit because it's going to come back up. We're going to go to kind of the third topic we get pushed on a lot, which is ROI. And ROI is hard, but I think there's another poll here, and I want to try to get the sense of, you know, what's worked for people here. So your ROI experience. What have you found to be the factors, to the extent that you've done data projects or data initiatives or anything of the sort? What have been the drivers for that return experience that clients are looking for? And again, check all that applies.
Right, clarity of results leading the way at 71%. Outcome certainty, 54, cost.
So the
readiness.
usual suspects. Any others that have made it into clearly defined deliverables? Oh, I like that. We're going to come back to that. Go Glynis. Yeah, so let's move on. Let's talk
clearly
about
defined results, obviously, but that's
well, the clarity of results is kind of the thing that you're going to get out of it and how it's presumably going to be helpful is really, I think, the upshot of that. And I think that there's a lot of work often in building plumbing, for instance, that is, I talked about as data engineering work that doesn't show to have a great payback. It builds you something that's infrastructure, but it's like building a solid basement for a nice house. It's not very satisfying to have a solid basement. It's just necessary. Because if you don't have a solid basement, you have a whole bunch of other problems. And I think that's kind of the clarity of results question is kind of a thing that if you have to do some plumbing work or some infrastructure work, it should be clear that that's what you're going to end up doing. If you're going to do data science work, then I think that's a thing. And that's actually part of the answer for us. The other part of the answer in ROI is that it's actually not where you think the goal line is for us most of the time. Usually in a consulting gig, you have the job of making your client happy. In data projects, the thing that's really tricky, and it's true of other projects, not just data, but it's especially true in data. Your client has clients. Your client is serving a constituency. And it's that constituency that will go back to that client and say, this was really good, or I never really used that, or something. And that's the measure your client is really going to settle in on in the end. So it is really good when you're working these projects through to think about your client being able to say the return to his or her constituency has been very high, and how you engineer that. And that's worth thinking about for a minute, because that's this very first step of defining the audience, understanding who the audience is for your data initiative. And that is the very beginning of the step of getting to clarity of results, which was the #1 bugbear on the ROI experience. For data engineering projects, it might be a division, it might be the whole enterprise, it might be finance, it might be operations, it might be something. But for data science projects, it's often a question. It's often, what price optimizes sales? Or what answer is the best answer for this? Or how do we build a bot that captures data 24/7 if we don't want to offer 24/7 call center service, and refers and thanks a client when it gets to the end of what it can do, and makes sure it gets into the queue first thing in the morning for a real person. That's a feature or a function or something. And so the scope for a data science project is often quite different from the scope of a data engineering project. And you see why these buckets are useful, and you could actually carve out that third area of BI projects here. But it's started to get a little crowded, and it started to run a little bit tight on time, and it started to run a little bit on, so we're kind of going to talk about it in the 2 buckets, but we could easily talk about it in 3. When you know the audience, you can define success. You can say, we're taking something live? Is it a pilot that we're going to run that shows that, that could scale if it worked? Or is it just a proof of concept that says, this is a really clever idea and you might need to invest a little bit more to get somewhere with it. But what are you trying to do? What's the goal? And that's a particular question in the engineering space. In the data science space, there's a different set of questions about defining success. One of the questions is, given that data science often leads to curated data in models that make predictions, you also have the job here of showing that the model is good. There was a mathematician who made the point that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so every model is an approximation of real life, and that's what he was getting at. The approximation makes it wrong often, but it's useful if you can use it to make predictions, if you can use it to get to answers about something. And I think that's a very kind of interesting way to look at that. So there's a real question about how you show that it's correct. And when you can show that it's correct, then you can start to have a question about, should this model and its predictions go live? If you were to take, there's lots of things that we could use as examples, but I think many people are very reluctant to bring a product live that might control pricing or something until they've had some experience with knowing that it's not going to do really dumb things with pricing. And that's the correct or better problem. So the defining success really requires understanding what the outcome is. And then we often describe these things in terms of objectives and key results, because it's sometimes hard to be specific about, we will improve sales by 4% in the first quarter if we, it's sometimes hard to do that. But I think everybody gets that, if we can move the yardsticks forward on a data science project, we'll do that. If we can make the data available here, one of our retail clients wanted to figure out how to get low on stock warnings into better shape so that they could avoid out of stocks, on one thing, on a range of products. And early warning was the key for them. And they found their ERP was good at it, but not good enough at it, is kind of where they were at on that. So we built something, and we're doing something else for someone else that, financial reporting. Their financial reporting system is good for a few things, but not flexible enough for the way they need to do project accounting in this particular case. And they don't want to change the accounting system, but they need to layer something else on top. So we're going to build some extra reporting around that. So OKRs are a good way to talk about the exact outcome you're expecting, what you're really going to help with in the process. And that's kind of a good way to frame that conversation.
But I think you're saying put some of the success goals in smaller chunks, right?
Yeah, we like that too. That's always good. Make it stepwise and make it consistent with that maturity model we talked about a little bit ago. If you are driving adoption, which was the prior topic, then you will have the opportunity to get the real ROI that comes from the change. And data will become more than a data project. It will become kind of continuing on that journey. You will need at some point to deal with topics like governance. You're going to have to put guardrails around how people use data. There's obviously privacy issues. There's going to be ethics issues, especially if you're in the AI space. And there's the how you grow to use data, how your client grows to use data more and better consistently over time. And that is the real, that's kind of, when they're asking that question, they're driving the ROI themselves with data out of the projects. And so I think that from a skills point of view, and the skills is important, I'm not worried about consulting skills, I'm worried about client skills here, and it should probably say that. We have to worry about technical skills, but we also have to worry about rolling this stuff out into production very fast. So there's a whole new model of kind of rolling things out very quickly called DevOps, and which is the integration of development and operations. There's making sure your client's skills stretch from way beyond Excel to wherever it is they need them to go. And the change issue here is that these are change projects, maybe more than they're even data projects. This all comes back to all of this, except that it's an all hands on deck kind of change project. And so change leadership is a really big thing if you're helping a client become more data savvy and drive ROI in the medium term. Choose small projects that, Craig, that was a good clarification. Choose small projects that make a lot of sense. And are stepwise, logically organized. Treat them as a bit of a program, and we kind of have a lot of room to move forward on that. But ultimately, your clients are going to want to own some of this and not depend entirely on external consultants because it's expensive. And so you're going to have to help them skill up, not only in using the data, but operating, managing, and maintaining.
So one of the ROIs, sorry, Ron.
Go ahead.
Reading one of the questions, Glennis came back with results are subjective while deliverables are objectives. And that ties in a little bit, or I'm trying to figure out how to tie it into my thinking that sometimes I've seen return on investment where the people at the office are now, they're starting to buy in. They're getting a level of enthusiasm or a more improved and more focused purpose. So I'm assuming that's a deliverable, but maybe not one that you spelled out initially. Well, probably something you're hoping for, right?
Yeah, I think that the question goes to measurement. It's easy to measure a few things. It's easy to measure sales. It's easy to measure costs. It's hard to measure the amount that this project contributed to a growth in sales. Data gives us tools to do that, by the way, but they're statistical tools. So I think that there's no question, but I think if you improved something, if you implemented an AI chatbot that gave you 24/7 coverage, 724 coverage, and you discovered that customer sat went up over the next 2 quarters, would you be prepared to attribute that to a clever chatbot? So I think that there's a question about what you're trying to do. And my sense here is that we want to connect these dots a little bit. There are outcomes that we're trying to drive, which are ultimately higher, for example, customer sat KPIs, or lower costs, or a different measure of better customer service, or a different measure of revenues in a new channel. Or there's always something you'd like to measure. And they are objectives initially, but the measurements and the connection, sometimes you have to reach a little bit to be sure that you've made the right connection. But I think that in a world where you have those, for instance, that chat bot and higher customer sat, there are ways to go back and say, actually, the customers who engaged with that chat bot, were they the people who had higher than average customer sat? These are things we can know. We're doing something right now that's doing a lot of careful journey mapping of visitors to a website that helps us to understand what pathway through the pages on the website that's trying to sell something led to a sale. Which pages that they're investing in were not so helpful. Which channels are more helpful than others. So these are a combination of mining the data and trying to understand how we pull it out. But I think that but they're all examples of the outcome is understanding how to manage the spend better in that case. And we're trying to figure out what the insights are and where the investments can be better managed. And they are entirely happy with correlated results as opposed to definitive causality, for example. So I don't know, I'm driving into data speak here, but I think that, they're happy with, what drives what on the trend, as opposed to what's distinctly provable. They don't mind spending money on this stuff if the other stuff is getting better too.
But I like the idea of adding journey mapping on as a second level of data research. And, if there's a follow-up on an initial BI KPI project, the journey mapping would be the perfect kind of follow-on or add-on.
Journey. Well, it turns out it's a reasonably large project because you end up with, a whole bucket load of page data out of a website, right? So it's actually, it turned out, it kind of surprised us how we're suddenly parsing through. And if we thought about it on the way in, we kind of did, but it's many, many millions of page hits over several years that we're analyzing the data over. For this client, many tens of millions of pages, in fact, that we're doing kind of journey mapping. But some trends are clearer than others. So I would say we've been talking a little bit about what's new. We've kind of covered a lot of territory. We've started with the what's new and the chat GPT, and we've kind of talked ourselves out of a little bit, allowing ourselves to be too distracted by bright, shiny objects, focusing a little bit on adoption and how to drive adoption, and focusing a little bit on how we get to connecting the dots on ROI. And often that's a careful stepwise process, but I think that's kind of how we think about it. And those are, from my point of view, some of the hardest questions we get and some of the things most worth kind of talking about in this environment.
I think when you've put it in the context of a data project could also involve change management project, I think that allows consultants who are advisors to look at this from another strategic level of implementation and ongoing improvement for their client.
And so important, Craig, so important, because I think that it's at the change level you can actually have real impact.
Right.
The data project's a technical component of making the right change for an organization. And so for us, our bandwidth is limited by our ability to drive change projects, frankly. You know, we can do lots of data projects, but I think that, you know, it's often we're looking to collaborate because that's a real thing for us. And it gives, I think, creates a lot of interesting collaboration opportunities to help drive the change in an actual client. The technical work is the technical work. It's tricky. You have to know how to deal with that. But I think that the change work is, without that, the impact is more likely to be mixed, harder to drive forward.
So we've got a few minutes left to go through some questions here. We've been picking up on these as the whole topic has been unfolding, and thank you everybody for jumping in along the way and bearing with us as we were reading the chat and trying to talk at the same time. Couple of questions. I just wanted to ask one, Ron, about the difference in a data project from a private sector client versus a public government sector client. Do you have any sort of insights on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think in the public sector environment is very rule bound. There's much more regulated. There's so many more constraints. In the private sector, the number of rules that apply are considerably fewer, and a private sector organization often has the ability to move quicker. But I think that that's not to say that it's not hard to do meaningful things. There's a lot of work that's really interesting that you can do in the public sector because of scale. Public sector organizations tend to have a lot of data, and they tend to be data rich in really interesting ways. So you have to be a little careful how you connect the dots. And these are, well, I would say for most private sector organizations, we have to help them to build good governance frameworks. In the public sector, we have to make sure we're staying on side with evolving governance frameworks. And the governance frameworks are, they always exist, but they are, you know, will this be subject to an access to information request? If it's subject to an access to information request, what does that mean? What will happen? What has to happen? So you need to think about some of those things along the way. There's obvious rules that everybody has to apply, that, you know, personal information and the protection of privacy. But those rules are often stricter again in government. So there are the projects look similar at the technical level. The framework and the context is more intricate in the public sector environment, but the payoff can be much larger too, because the data set is naturally quite a bit larger, usually.
So one last question here from Ian Campbell. Maybe you could give a percentage of success for an IT-driven managed project versus a finance one or an end user one.
So I don't know about percentages. Good question. I hate questions that, you know, ask me for that. I like them better instinctively when they are user-driven or department-driven as opposed to IT-driven. And I like them better because I have a fighting chance of knowing who the user community will be and asking them how, and being able to ask them how they'll benefit from this. So I prefer that, which is not to say that IT-driven projects don't work. Sometimes the IT department actually really knows what needs to be done. They work better often if they're plumbing projects or data engineering projects, because IT is closer to the mark on some of that. But I think that, or it's more their wheelhouse, maybe is a better way to say that. But I think that but I like it when the users are engaged, right? We have, one client where we're bringing in their director of customer service to our offices next week for a bit of a brainstorming session, and to make sure that he and his team get exactly what they need in something we're building out. So I know who the user is, I can get him to participate in it, and it's going to be what he wants it to be. And IT's supporting it, but I like it better when I know who the users are. I can talk to them.
So the success rate might be higher when you're coming in from that angle. Of course, depends what your success markers are.
Yeah.
Right. Because in some cases with these projects, the first success marker is just getting all the data maybe into some cloud area where you can actually just report on it, and then begin to drill down on what the rightness of the data is, and then start to ask the right questions, and maybe even start to ask the difficult questions. Right. That's the key in my mind.
That's the key. That's the key to driving exactly the successful change project we're looking for.
Right.
Right. And so, and honestly, you need to know the client a little bit to do that too.
Right. Well, thank you, Ron, for being our guest speaker today. Fantastic. I also want to thank CMC Ontario and our events coordinator, Sandra Addison Brock, and CMC Canada. Check out Converge from GTA on February 28th. Register now for March 8th. What's Up Wednesday with guest host Jennifer Smith and a great slate of female consultants discussing issues of the day for women in consulting. Remember, make the data work for you. Take a risk on a good idea. Be strategic. See where the change is. Think outside the box and make that computer box work for you. Shake out the doldrums. Be a rebel with your transmission and your live wire. Hook up your data for the future. Thank you all and have a great day. Cheers.